To understand the Crusades, we must begin far earlier than the year 1095. We need to look at what happened to the Mediterranean world after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. After Rome collapsed in the West, Europe entered a long transitional period, often referred to as the early Middle Ages. Political unity disappeared, long-distance trade declined, cities shrank, and Roman infrastructure slowly decayed. Roads were no longer maintained, aqueducts fell into disuse, and many urban centers lost their economic function. Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman administration in Western Europe. Over time, these kingdoms adopted Christianity, specifically the Latin or Catholic form. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire did not fall. What we now call the Byzantine Empire continued to exist, centered on Constantinople. Its inhabitants still considered themselves Romans, preserved Roman law, maintained urban life, and controlled key trade routes. As centuries passed, Christianity itself began to diverge. Western Christianity developed under the authority of the Pope in Rome, while Eastern Christianity evolved under the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine Emperor. This division was slow, gradual, and not initially perceived as final. Differences in language, ritual, church organization, and theology accumulated over time. For several centuries, the Pope in Rome was effectively under Byzantine influence. Many early medieval popes were approved or appointed with the consent of the Byzantine emperor and his representatives in Italy. These were later called Byzantine popes. But as Byzantine power in the West declined, the papacy gradually became more independent. By the year 1000, the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity had become deep and structural. Mutual suspicion had grown, and the idea of a unified Christian church was already under strain, even if no formal break had yet occurred. This fractured Christian world would soon face powerful external pressures that reshaped the entire Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire's survival is one of the most remarkable stories in medieval history. Repeatedly, it stood on the edge of collapse and yet endured. In the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian, Byzantium faced devastating plagues, costly wars with the Sassanid Persian Empire, and near constant pressure on its borders. At several moments, contemporaries believed the empire would not survive. Constantinople was besieged, its resources stretched, and its population reduced by disease. In the 7th century, the situation appeared even worse. The rise of Islam transformed the political landscape of the Middle East. Arab armies conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, regions that had been part of the Roman world for centuries. Jerusalem, Damascus, and Alexandria were lost. Once again, it seemed that Byzantium would fall. Yet the empire adapted. It reorganized its military, restructured its administration, and managed to hold Anatolia and the Balkans. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Byzantium even began to recover some ground, stabilizing its borders and preserving its core territories. At the same time, massive demographic changes reshaped southeastern Europe. Slavic migrations flooded into the Balkans, transforming regions that had once been predominantly Greek-speaking. Turkic Bulgars arrived from the steppe, eventually merging with Slavic populations and forming the medieval Bulgarian state. Over time, these groups converted to Christianity, largely under Byzantine influence. Byzantium also played a crucial civilizational role. Through missionaries such as Cyril and Methodius, it spread Christianity, literacy, and political models to the Slavic world. The Christianization of Bulgaria and later of Kievan Rus tied large regions of Eastern Europe to the Byzantine cultural sphere. Despite constant pressure, Byzantium remained a wealthy, urbanized, and diplomatically sophisticated state. Its survival depended not only on military force, but on negotiation, trade and strategic flexibility. However, by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, new threats were approaching, ones that would fundamentally alter the balance of power. While Byzantium struggled to survive, the Islamic world experienced a period of extraordinary expansion and cultural growth. By the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, had become the intellectual and economic heart of much of the known world. Trade networks connected the Mediterranean to India and China. Scholars translated Greek texts, advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography, and preserved knowledge that would later reach Europe. This Islamic world was not politically unified for long. Although the Abbasid Caliph was formally recognized as the spiritual leader, real power fragmented. Independent rulers governed regions such as Egypt, North Africa, and Al-Andalus in Spain. In Cairo, the Fatimid dynasty established a rival Shiite caliphate. In Spain, Umayyad rulers declared their own caliphate in Córdoba. This created a paradoxical situation. Culturally and economically, the Islamic world flourished. Politically, it was divided, often unstable, and internally competitive. Rival dynasties fought each other while still sharing a common religious framework. Western Europe, by contrast, remained marginal. Cut off from major trade routes, it produced little that other civilizations wanted. Goods reached Europe through multiple intermediaries at high cost. Material culture lagged behind that of Byzantium and the Islamic world. Yet Europe was slowly changing. Medieval towns began to grow, local trade revived, and feudal structures stabilized political authority. By the 11th century, Western Europe was no longer merely surviving, it was reorganizing. Crucially, contact zones emerged. In Spain and Sicily, Christian and Muslim powers clashed, coexisted, and exchanged ideas. In these regions, Europeans learned that Muslim states could be defeated, and that their wealth was immense. This realization would prove decisive when a new force appeared from Central Asia and shattered the fragile balance of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the 11th century, a new power entered the Middle Eastern stage, the Seljuk Turks. Originating from the Central Asian steppes, the Seljuks were Turkic nomads who had recently converted to Islam. Their version of Islam was politically militant and deeply tied to conquest. Unlike earlier Islamic empires, which had grown out of urban cultures, the Seljuks were shaped by steppe warfare. Mobility, cavalry tactics, and constant expansion defined their approach. After entering the Islamic world, they quickly rose to prominence by serving as military protectors of the Abbasid caliphs, while gradually taking real power for themselves. Their expansion brought them into direct conflict with Byzantium. For centuries, Byzantium had relied on diplomacy, fortified cities, and professional armies to manage its borders. Against the Seljuks, these methods began to fail. The turning point came in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantine army, led by Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, faced Seljuk forces under Alp Arslan. The battle ended in catastrophic defeat for Byzantium. The emperor was captured, the army collapsed, and Byzantine authority in eastern Anatolia disintegrated almost overnight. Manzikert was not just a military loss. It shattered the defensive system of the empire. Anatolia, which had been the empire's primary source of manpower, food, and tax revenue, was suddenly open to Turkish settlement. Over the following decades, Turkic groups flooded into the region, permanently transforming its ethnic and cultural landscape. This was the beginning of the Turkification of Anatolia. Lands that had been Greek-speaking and Christian for centuries were gradually reshaped into what would later become Turkey. Byzantium survived, but it was now gravely weakened. And just as its eastern defenses collapsed, its relationship with Western Christianity reached a breaking point. In 1054, a symbolic and theological rupture became official. This event is known as the Great Schism. For centuries, tensions had existed between Rome and Constantinople. Disagreements over doctrine, church authority, liturgy, and language had accumulated. The most fundamental issue was power. whether the Pope in Rome held authority over the entire Christian world or whether the patriarchs of the East were equals within a shared church. In 1054, representatives of the Pope excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. In response, the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope. Although contemporaries did not immediately perceive this as a permanent division, it formalized a split that would prove lasting. Western Christianity became Roman Catholicism. Eastern Christianity became Orthodox Christianity. Communication continued, but trust eroded rapidly. This schism occurred at the worst possible moment for Byzantium. Facing Turkish expansion and internal instability, the empire was now religiously isolated from the West. Cooperation was still possible, but it required political pragmatism rather than shared identity. Despite this, Byzantine emperors understood that Western military assistance might be their only chance of survival. One emperor in particular would attempt to turn religious rivalry into strategic cooperation. His name was Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios Komnenos came to power in 1081, during one of the most dangerous periods in Byzantine history. The empire faced threats on all fronts: Turks in Anatolia, Norman adventurers in the West, Pecheneg nomads in the Balkans, and economic decline. Alexios proved to be an able and pragmatic ruler. He stabilized the empire internally, reformed its finances, and used diplomacy as skillfully as force. He hired foreign mercenaries, including Scandinavian warriors known as Varangians, and incorporated former enemies into imperial service. Yet Anatolia remained largely lost. The Seljuks had established the Sultanate of Rum, literally Rome, on Byzantine land. Even the Turks recognized the prestige of Roman legitimacy. Alexios understood that Byzantium alone could not reverse this loss. He therefore took a calculated risk. He sent envoys to Western Europe, including to the Pope, requesting military assistance. Importantly, Alexios did not ask for a holy war. He asked for professional soldiers, mercenaries, who could help reclaim imperial territory. Jerusalem was not mentioned. Palestine was not mentioned. His appeal was strategic, not religious. At the same time, Alexios hinted that cooperation might ease tensions between the Eastern and Western churches. There was hope, perhaps naive, that shared military effort could lead to religious reconciliation. This message reached Rome at a very particular moment. The papacy itself was undergoing a transformation, and its leader saw an opportunity far greater than simple military aid. That leader was Pope Urban II. At the end of the 11th century, the papacy was not the stable, unquestioned institution it would later become. Rome itself was a battlefield of political and religious conflict. For decades, popes had competed with rival claimants known as anti-popes. These rival figures were backed by different factions within the Holy Roman Empire and the Italian nobility. As a result, the authority of the papacy was deeply contested, even within Western Christendom. Pope Urban II emerged from this struggle as a reformist leader. He belonged to a movement that sought to strengthen the moral and political power of the Church. Unlike many of his predecessors, Urban did not rely solely on elite backing. Instead, he traveled extensively, preaching directly to clergy and laypeople across France and northern Italy. Urban was a gifted speaker. His sermons emphasized renewal, discipline, and divine mission. By the early 1090s, he had successfully consolidated support in much of Western Europe, particularly in France. His rival, anti-pope Clement III, was increasingly marginalized. By the time Alexios I's request for help arrived from Constantinople, Urban II was in a strong position. But he needed a defining act, something that would unify Western Christendom under papal leadership and elevate Rome above secular rulers. The Byzantine appeal offered precisely that opportunity. In November 1095, Pope Urban II convened a church council in the French city of Clermont. Officially, the council addressed internal church reforms. but its final session became one of the most consequential moments in medieval history. Urban spoke of events in the East. He described Christian suffering, threats to sacred places, and the desecration of holy sites. His speech transformed a political request for military aid into a universal religious call. Jerusalem was placed at the center of the narrative. The city where Christ had lived, preached, and died was portrayed as defiled and in need of liberation. The audience, deeply shaped by biblical imagination, understood Jerusalem not as a distant city, but as the spiritual center of the world. Urban promised extraordinary rewards. Those who took part in the expedition would receive full remission of sins. This was unprecedented. Participation in war, traditionally considered morally dangerous, was redefined as a path to salvation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds erupted in collective agreement. The phrase Deus vult, God wills it, became the symbolic expression of the moment. For the first time in Christian history, warfare was explicitly framed as a sacred duty. A crusade was born. The success of Urban's call cannot be understood without the religious mindset of the time. Around the year 1000, apocalyptic expectations were widespread. Many believed history was approaching its final stage. Biblical prophecy spoke of a final Christian ruler who would unite the world before the coming of the Antichrist and the Last Judgment. For some, the crusade appeared as a step toward fulfilling this cosmic narrative. Participation was not merely obedience, it was agency. Crusaders believed they were actively shaping sacred history. They were no longer observers of biblical events, but actors within them. Crucially, Urban's promise of total absolution changed the moral logic of war. Crusaders believed their past sins were forgiven, and that even future sins would not condemn them. The fear of damnation was removed. This theological innovation unleashed unprecedented energy. Knights, nobles, peasants, and townspeople pledged to go east. Entire families sold land, mortgaged estates, and abandoned livelihoods. Yet this enthusiasm created chaos. The crusade was not yet an army. It was a movement, emotional, unstructured, and dangerous. Before the organized forces of Europe could assemble, something unexpected happened. The First Crusade began, not with knights and kings, but with the poor. Before any kings or organized armies could depart, the crusading movement exploded from below. Thousands of ordinary people, peasants, laborers, minor knights, and the urban poor set out for the Holy Land on their own initiative. This movement is known as the People's Crusade. Its participants believed they were undertaking a massive pilgrimage rather than a military campaign. Few had weapons, supplies, or any understanding of distance, logistics, or warfare. What they had was conviction. The most prominent preacher of this movement was Peter the Hermit. He traveled from town to town, repeating the core message of Claremont: Jerusalem must be freed, and God would protect those who went. His sermons mobilized crowds almost instantly. Groups formed spontaneously and began marching eastward in waves. There was no central command, no coordination, and no plan for provisioning. Many assumed that God would provide food and safety along the way. At first, local Christian communities welcomed them. Villages offered food, shelter, and encouragement. But as numbers grew and discipline collapsed, these migrating crowds became increasingly unstable. Violence followed. As crusading bands moved through the Rhineland and Central Europe, their religious fervor turned inward. Many participants asked a simple question: why travel thousands of kilometers to fight enemies of Christ when non-Christians lived nearby? Jewish communities, long tolerated but socially isolated, became immediate targets. Massacres erupted in cities such as Mainz, Worms, and Cologne. Entire Jewish populations were murdered or forcibly converted. These pogroms were not ordered by the papacy, but they were enabled by the logic of sacred violence that the crusade had unleashed. Church authorities attempted to intervene in some cases, but they often failed. Local rulers were either unwilling or unable to stop the mobs. As the People's Crusade moved into Hungary, the situation worsened. Hungarian authorities had not been consulted, and they were unprepared for armed masses demanding food and passage. Clashes broke out. Entire crusading groups were attacked and destroyed. By the time the survivors reached Byzantine territory, they were exhausted, starving, and violent. The Byzantine Empire had requested professional military assistance. Instead, it received chaos. Emperor Alexios I was alarmed by the arrival of tens of thousands of undisciplined crusaders. He quickly arranged to transport them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, hoping to remove them from imperial lands as fast as possible. Once across, the People's Crusade entered Seljuk-controlled territory without reconnaissance, supply lines, or leadership. They advanced blindly, convinced that divine protection would compensate for military weakness. It did not. Seljuk forces quickly surrounded and annihilated them near Nicaea. Thousands were killed. Survivors were enslaved. The People's Crusade effectively ceased to exist within weeks. Peter the Hermit survived only because he had returned to Constantinople before the final disaster. The lesson was brutal and clear. Faith alone was not enough. Soon after, the real crusade arrived, led by Europe's military elite. After the destruction of the People's Crusade, the situation around Constantinople temporarily stabilized. What Emperor Alexios I had originally asked for now finally began to arrive. Throughout late 1096 and early 1097, organized military contingents from Western Europe reached the Byzantine capital. These were not mobs, but professional armies led by experienced nobles, men who understood warfare, command structures, and logistics. Among them were Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and several other powerful lords. Their forces included armored knights, trained infantry, and support personnel. This was the military elite of Western Christendom. However, unity was only superficial. These armies spoke different languages, followed different customs, and recognized different political authorities. Even within single contingents, loyalty was often personal rather than institutional. For Byzantium, their arrival was both a relief and a danger. Alexios needed their military strength, but he also feared their intentions. The memory of the People's Crusade had demonstrated how destructive uncontrolled crusaders could be. The emperor therefore insisted on a clear political framework before allowing the crusaders to proceed. Alexios I demanded that each crusade leader swear an oath of loyalty to him. Any former Byzantine territory recaptured from the Turks would be returned to imperial control. From the Byzantine perspective, this was entirely reasonable. The Crusaders were entering imperial lands, using imperial infrastructure, and receiving imperial logistical support. Byzantium expected restoration, not conquest. From the Crusaders' perspective, the demand was deeply uncomfortable. They had not come to serve the Emperor of Constantinople. Many viewed Byzantines as untrustworthy, overly diplomatic, and insufficiently committed to holy war. Nevertheless, Alexios controlled the crossings, supplies, and access to Anatolia. One by one, the crusade leaders agreed to swear modified versions of the oath. This moment defined the future relationship between Byzantium and the Crusaders. Cooperation was enforced, not trusted. Each side assumed the other would betray them when convenient. Once the oaths were taken, Alexios acted decisively. He ferried the crusading armies across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, ensuring they moved quickly and did not linger near Constantinople. The crusade had finally begun in earnest. The first major target was Nicaea, a fortified city held by the Seljuks and located dangerously close to Constantinople. For Byzantium, Nicaea was strategically vital. For the Crusaders, it was the first test of coordinated warfare. The siege revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Crusader armies excelled in direct assault, but lacked experience in prolonged sieges. Byzantine engineers and naval forces provided critical support by cutting the city off from supply routes across Lake Ascania. Eventually, the city surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but to Byzantine negotiators. Alexios had secretly arranged the surrender to prevent the city from being sacked. Byzantine troops entered Nicaea under imperial banners, while Crusader forces were kept outside the walls. The reaction among the Crusaders was immediate and hostile. They felt cheated of plunder and glory. To them, this looked like betrayal. For the Byzantines, it was simple statecraft. Nicaea was restored intact, its population spared, and imperial authority reasserted. This incident poisoned relations permanently. From this point forward, Crusaders would increasingly act independently, trusting neither Byzantine intentions nor promises. Despite this, the campaign continued. The Crusaders marched eastward into Anatolia, facing extreme heat, water shortages, and constant Turkish harassment. The road to Jerusalem would be far longer and far bloodier than anyone had imagined. After Nicaea, the crusading armies entered the heart of Anatolia, a region fundamentally different from anything they had known in Europe. This was not a land of dense cities and frequent settlements. It was dry, open, and hostile. Seljuk forces avoided pitched battles. Instead, they relied on constant harassment. Light cavalry attacked from a distance, cutting down stragglers, poisoning wells, and retreating before the Crusaders could respond. The goal was not decisive victory, but exhaustion. The Crusaders quickly learned that their heavy cavalry, so effective in Western Europe, was ill-suited for this environment. Horses suffered from heat and lack of water. Armor became a liability. Supply lines stretched thin. March discipline deteriorated. Columns broke apart as soldiers searched for water and food. Thousands died not in battle, but from dehydration, disease, and exposure. Yet the Crusaders adapted. They reorganized their marching formations, improved scouting, and learned to protect their flanks. Small victories restored morale and demonstrated that the Turks were not invincible. By late 1097, the Crusaders emerged from Anatolia, battered but intact. Ahead of them lay Syria, and the city that would define the entire campaign, Antioch. Antioch was one of the greatest cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Heavily fortified, economically vital, and strategically positioned, it controlled access to Syria and the Levant. The city's walls stretched for kilometers, reinforced by hundreds of towers. Antioch could not be taken by direct assault. A siege was unavoidable. The Crusaders arrived in October 1097. They were already exhausted, undersupplied, and far from home. Yet abandoning Antioch was impossible. Leaving such a fortress behind would expose their rear to attack. The siege dragged on for months. Food shortages became severe. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Desertion increased. Morale collapsed. Winter worsened conditions. Rain turned camps into mud. Disease spread rapidly. Starvation became widespread. Despite this, internal rivalries among the Crusade leaders continued. Coordination was poor. Each noble guarded his own forces and interests. Antioch did not fall by force. It fell through betrayal. A tower commander inside the city, dissatisfied with Seljuk rule, agreed to open a gate. In June 1098, Crusaders entered Antioch under cover of night. The city was theirs, but victory came at a terrible cost. Almost immediately after Antioch was taken, disaster struck. A massive Seljuk relief army arrived and placed the Crusaders under siege inside the city they had just captured. The besiegers became the besieged. conditions worsened beyond anything previously endured. Starvation reached extremes. Contemporary sources describe cannibalism. Discipline disintegrated. Despair spread. Some leaders attempted to flee. Peter the Hermit was captured while trying to escape and forced to return. At the lowest point, a peasant claimed to have received a divine vision. He reported the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. The relic was found beneath the floor of a church. Whether genuine or not, its psychological impact was enormous. Morale surged. The Crusaders believed divine favor had returned. Against all odds, they launched a sortie against the besieging army. The Seljuks, divided and overconfident, were defeated. Antioch was secured. But a new question emerged. Who would rule it? After the victory at Antioch, the Crusaders faced a problem they have not seriously anticipated: what to do with conquered territory. Officially, all former Byzantine lands were supposed to be returned to Emperor Alexios I. In reality, the situation on the ground made this arrangement fragile. The siege of Antioch had lasted nearly a year. The Crusaders had suffered starvation, disease, and near total collapse. They believed that whatever they now possessed had been earned at an unbearable cost. Handing Antioch over without compensation was unacceptable to many leaders. Bohemond of Taranto emerged as the central figure in this dispute. A Norman warrior with experience fighting Byzantium in southern Italy, Bohemond argued that the emperor had failed his obligations. Alexios had not come to relieve Antioch during the crisis, and therefore, in Bohemond's view, the oaths no longer applied. Other crusade leaders hesitated, but exhaustion and pragmatism prevailed. Antioch became the first crusader state, ruled by Bohemond as Prince of Antioch. This decision marked a fundamental shift. The crusade was no longer only a military expedition. It had become a project of settlement and governance. European nobles were now establishing permanent political entities in the eastern Mediterranean. Relations with Byzantium deteriorated sharply. From the Byzantine perspective, Antioch's seizure was a betrayal. From the Crusaders' perspective, it was survival. Despite internal tensions, the main crusading army continued south. Jerusalem remained the ultimate objective, and Antioch, though important, was only a step along the way. After securing Antioch, the crusading forces resumed their march toward Jerusalem in early 1099. By this point, the army was significantly reduced. Years of warfare, disease, and desertion had taken their toll. The march south passed through regions controlled by a patchwork of Muslim powers. Political fragmentation worked in the Crusaders' favor. Local rulers often preferred negotiation over resistance, allowing the army to pass in exchange for promises of non-aggression. Supplies improved as the army reached the Mediterranean coast. Italian city-states, particularly Genoa, provided naval support, transporting food, timber, and siege equipment. Without this maritime assistance, the final assault would have been impossible. In June 1099, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. The city had recently changed hands and was now controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. Its defenses were strong, and water was scarce. The Crusaders were exhausted, outnumbered, and far from reinforcement. Yet retreat was unthinkable. Jerusalem was the spiritual core of the entire expedition. The siege preparations began immediately. Timber was dismantled from ships and surrounding settlements to build siege towers. Time was critical. A large Egyptian army was reportedly advancing north. The final confrontation was approaching. The siege of Jerusalem lasted just over a month, but its intensity surpassed everything the Crusaders had endured before. Heat, thirst, and disease plagued the attackers. Water shortages were severe, forcing strict rationing. On July 15, 1099, the final assault began. Siege towers were pushed toward the walls under heavy fire. After repeated failures, a breakthrough was achieved near the northern defenses. Once the Crusaders entered the city, discipline collapsed. What followed was a massacre of Jerusalem's inhabitants, Muslims and Jews alike, and possibly Eastern Christians as well. Contemporary sources describe streets filled with bodies and blood. From the Crusaders' perspective, this violence was interpreted as divine justice and purification. Modern perspectives recognize it as an atrocity rooted in religious extremism and years of accumulated trauma. Jerusalem was now under Christian control for the first time in centuries. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as ruler, refusing the title of king and instead calling himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. A new political order was established, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yet victory carried a hidden weakness. Many Crusaders, having fulfilled their vows, returned home. The new state was left with limited manpower, surrounded by hostile powers. The First Crusade had succeeded, but its success was fragile. The capture of Jerusalem did not bring stability. It exposed how precarious the Crusaders' success truly was. The new Kingdom of Jerusalem existed in an overwhelmingly hostile environment, surrounded by stronger and more populous Muslim states. Most Crusaders had fulfilled their religious vows by reaching the Holy City. Large numbers returned to Europe almost immediately. Those who remained were too few to secure borders, garrison cities, and defend trade routes at the same time. The Crusader states were geographically fragmented. Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli were separated by long distances and hostile territory. Communication and coordination were slow and unreliable. Reinforcements from Europe could take years to arrive, if they came at all. Economically, the new states depended heavily on Italian merchants. In exchange for naval support and supplies, cities like Genoa and Venice received commercial privileges and autonomous quarters in Crusader ports. This arrangement ensured survival, but weakened political independence. Militarily, the Crusaders relied on castles. Fortified strongholds dotted the landscape, controlling roads and valleys. These castles allowed small garrisons to resist much larger forces, but they also tied manpower to static defense. Religious divisions further complicated matters. Latin Christian rulers governed populations that were mostly Muslim, Jewish, or Eastern Christian. Tensions were constant, and loyalty was uncertain. The Crusaders had won Jerusalem, but they had not won security. Their position depended on constant vigilance, external support, and the continued weakness of their enemies. That weakness would not last. In the years following the First Crusade, the Muslim world began to recover from shock and fragmentation. The loss of Jerusalem was initially perceived as a regional disaster, not a civilizational one. Over time, its symbolic importance grew. At first, Muslim rulers focused on local conflicts. Rival dynasties continued to fight each other. Crusader states exploited this disunity, surviving not through strength but through division among their enemies. Gradually, however, attitudes changed. Religious scholars reframed the conflict as a defensive jihad. The presence of foreign Christian rulers in sacred lands became intolerable. This ideological shift did not produce immediate unity, but it created a shared narrative. Resistance was no longer merely political, it was religious. Leadership began to consolidate. Strong rulers emerged who prioritized long-term strategy over short-term rivalry. Step by step, Muslim states coordinated military pressure on Crusader territories. The Crusaders struggled to respond. Their forces were small, dependent on reinforcements, and internally divided. Leadership disputes weakened cohesion, while European support declined as enthusiasm faded. The balance of power was shifting. The Crusader states had been born from an extraordinary moment of momentum. Now they faced a reorganized and increasingly determined opposition. The era of easy survival was ending. The First Crusade left a legacy far greater than the territories it created. It permanently altered relations between Christianity and Islam, embedding conflict into collective memory on both sides. For Western Europe, the Crusade expanded horizons. It opened trade routes, increased contact with Eastern knowledge, and introduced Europeans to new goods, technologies, and ideas. At the same time, it normalized religious violence as a tool of policy. For Byzantium, the consequences were largely negative. Although some territory was recovered, trust between East and West collapsed. The Crusaders' actions confirmed Byzantine fears about Western ambition. In the Islamic world, the Crusade became a symbol of foreign invasion. Over time, Jerusalem transformed from a regional city into a central emblem of resistance and identity. Most importantly, the Crusade created a precedent. Holy war, once declared, could be repeated. Appeals to faith could mobilize entire societies. Future crusades would follow, larger, more destructive, and less successful. The First Crusade was unique. It succeeded not because it was inevitable, but because circumstances aligned once and only once. Its consequences would echo for centuries. The success of the First Crusade reshaped how Western Europe understood war, faith, and divine intervention. What had once seemed extraordinary now became a precedent. If Jerusalem could be taken once, it could be taken again. This change in mindset was critical. The First Crusade had relied on a rare convergence of factors: Muslim political fragmentation, Byzantine cooperation at key moments, and unprecedented religious enthusiasm. Later generations would assume that these conditions were permanent rather than temporary. In Europe, crusading became institutionalized. The Church refined the language of holy war, formalized vows, and clarified spiritual rewards. Participation in crusades was increasingly framed as a normal, even expected expression of Christian duty. At the same time, practical realities were ignored. The fragility of the Crusader states, their dependence on external aid, and their demographic weakness were underestimated. Distance was treated as an inconvenience rather than a strategic obstacle. Reports from the East often exaggerated success and downplayed danger. Appeals for help from Jerusalem and Antioch were filtered through religious rhetoric, reinforcing the belief that divine favor guaranteed victory. By the 1130s, this confidence collided with reality. Muslim powers were no longer divided. They had learned from earlier defeats and adapted their strategies accordingly. When the Crusader state of Edessa fell in 1144, it shocked Western Christendom. For the first time, a Crusader principality had been decisively destroyed. The loss of Edessa triggered a response shaped not by careful assessment, but by expectation. A new crusade was called, not as an experiment, but as an obligation. The Second Crusade began under very different circumstances from the first. It was larger, more organized, and led by kings rather than nobles. Its leaders included Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Yet despite its impressive scale, the expedition lacked strategic clarity. There was no consensus on objectives, routes, or coordination with local allies. Lessons from the First Crusade were poorly understood. The journey through Anatolia proved disastrous. Turkish forces, now experienced in fighting Crusaders, repeated earlier tactics with greater effectiveness. Supply failures, ambushes, and internal discord devastated the armies. By the time surviving forces reached the Levant, morale was low and numbers were reduced. Instead of focusing on realistic goals, the Crusaders chose to attack Damascus, an illogical target that had previously been a potential ally. The siege collapsed quickly. Poor coordination, lack of local support, and mistrust between leaders led to retreat. The crusade ended in humiliation. The failure of the Second Crusade shattered assumptions of guaranteed success. It revealed that divine favor could not compensate for strategic incompetence. For the Muslim world, the outcome confirmed a new reality. Crusaders could be defeated consistently, not just occasionally. The balance of power continued to shift. After the Second Crusade, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a new phase. Muslim political consolidation accelerated, particularly under leaders who combined military skill with religious legitimacy. The most significant of these figures was Saladin. Through careful diplomacy and warfare, he unified Egypt and Syria, surrounding the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a coherent and powerful state. Meanwhile, the Crusader states stagnated. European support declined as enthusiasm waned and skepticism grew. Crusading no longer felt miraculous. It felt costly. Internally, Crusader society hardened. Religious tolerance diminished. Militarization increased, and survival replaced expansion as the primary goal. Orders such as the Templars and Hospitallers became central to defense. The idea of crusade persisted, but its character changed. It was no longer a spontaneous movement driven by belief alone. It became a recurring, increasingly desperate response to strategic decline. By the late 12th century, another confrontation was inevitable. The symbolic weight of Jerusalem, combined with new Muslim unity, made conflict unavoidable. The next crusade would not resemble the first. It would be shaped by memory, rivalry, and fear. And it would begin with catastrophe. By the 1180s, the strategic situation of the Crusader states had deteriorated beyond recovery. Saladin's unification of Egypt and Syria fundamentally changed the balance of power. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced a single, coordinated opponent. Internal divisions weakened the Crusaders further. Rival factions competed for influence, while leadership lacked coherence. The kingdom's resources were stretched thin, and its military depended heavily on the knightly orders. The decisive confrontation came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. Crusader forces, attempting to relieve the city of Tiberias, marched through arid terrain under extreme heat. Deprived of water and harassed constantly, they reached the battlefield exhausted and disorganized. Saladin exploited every weakness. His forces surrounded the Crusaders, cut off retreat, and destroyed their cohesion. The Crusader army was annihilated. The true cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, was captured. With the field army destroyed, Jerusalem was defenseless. Saladin entered the city later that year. Unlike the Crusaders in 1099, he ordered restraint. Inhabitants were ransomed rather than massacred. While violence occurred, it was limited and controlled. The loss of Jerusalem shocked Europe. The city that had defined crusading identity for nearly a century was gone. This was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological collapse. The belief in permanent Christian possession of Jerusalem had been shattered. The response would be immediate and massive. The fall of Jerusalem triggered the Third Crusade, one of the most famous expeditions of the medieval world. Its leaders were the most powerful rulers in Europe: Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick never reached the Holy Land. He drowned in Anatolia, and most of his army dispersed. The crusade continued under Richard and Philip, whose rivalry undermined cooperation from the outset. Richard proved to be an exceptional military commander. He achieved several battlefield victories against Saladin and secured key coastal cities, including Acre and Jaffa. Militarily, the crusade was effective. Strategically, it was limited. Jerusalem remained out of reach. Repeated debates over whether to attack the city ended in indecision. Richard understood that even if Jerusalem were taken, it could not be held. In 1192, Richard and Saladin negotiated a settlement. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were granted access to holy sites. The Third Crusade ended without achieving its primary goal. Yet it established a new pattern. Crusading was no longer about total victory. It was about negotiation, containment, and damage control. The era of miraculous conquest was over. By the end of the 12th century, the crusading movement had reached its structural limits. The idea of holy war remained powerful, but its effectiveness was increasingly constrained by political reality. European rulers pursued crusades alongside their own interests, often using them to advance personal or dynastic goals. Religious unity fractured under competition and mistrust. Logistics became decisive. Distance, cost, and coordination proved more influential than belief. Crusades required enormous resources, and failure became more common than success. At the same time, Muslim states continued to consolidate. Leadership became more centralized, military organization improved, and ideological commitment hardened. Jerusalem remained symbolically central, but strategically secondary. Control of ports, trade routes, and supply lines mattered more than sacred geography. The crusading idea did not disappear. Instead, it expanded beyond the Holy Land. Crusades were declared against heretics in Europe, against pagans in the Baltic, and eventually against political enemies of the papacy. What began as a response to a specific historical crisis had become a permanent tool of policy. The First Crusade had been an exception. Everything that followed was an attempt to recreate a moment that could not be repeated. By the beginning of the 13th century, the crusading movement had drifted far from its original purpose. The Fourth Crusade, proclaimed in 1198 by Pope Innocent III, was intended to strike at Muslim power through Egypt, the strategic heart of the Eastern Mediterranean. From the start, the expedition was shaped by financial dependence. The Crusaders lacked funds to transport themselves and turned to Venice for ships. In exchange, Venice demanded military assistance against its commercial rivals. This arrangement immediately compromised the Crusades' direction. Instead of sailing to Egypt, the Crusaders were diverted to attack the Christian city of Zara, a Venetian rival. The city was captured and looted despite papal condemnation. Soon after, a new opportunity emerged. Byzantine princes, locked in dynastic struggle, offered the Crusaders money, supplies, and church union in exchange for military support. What followed was unprecedented. In 1204, the crusading army attacked Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world. The city fell after a brutal assault. It was looted extensively. Churches were desecrated, relics stolen, and entire districts destroyed. A Latin empire was established on Byzantine ruins. This was not a deviation, it was a transformation. The crusade had turned fully inward. The attack on Constantinople permanently destroyed any remaining trust between Eastern and Western Christianity. It also fatally weakened Byzantium, leaving it vulnerable to future conquest. The Fourth Crusade marked the moment when holy war ceased to be primarily about Jerusalem and became a flexible instrument of political ambition. The consequences of the Fourth Crusade were profound and irreversible. Byzantium never truly recovered from the sack of Constantinople. Although Greek successor states eventually reclaimed the city in 1261, the empire that emerged was a shadow of its former self. Economically weakened, politically fragmented, and militarily exhausted, Byzantium lost its ability to control Anatolia or project power. Western powers benefited commercially. Venetian dominance of Mediterranean trade expanded dramatically. Crusading had become deeply intertwined with economic exploitation. Meanwhile, enthusiasm for crusades continued to decline. Each successive expedition delivered fewer results and greater costs. Appeals from the papacy grew more frequent and less effective. In the Muslim world, the threat shifted. The focus moved away from crusaders toward new forces emerging from Central Asia. Mongol invasions devastated vast regions, temporarily reshaping power dynamics. Ironically, Crusader states survived longer due to Muslim attention being diverted elsewhere. But this was only a delay. By the late 13th century, Muslim powers had recovered and reorganized once again. The remaining Crusader strongholds were systematically eliminated. In 1291, Acre fell. It was the last major Crusader city in the Holy Land. 2 centuries after Clermont, the crusading experiment in the Levant was over. What remained was memory and ideology. The end of the Crusader states did not mean the end of crusading as an idea. Instead, the concept transformed and dispersed. Crusades continued to be preached, but their targets shifted. Campaigns were launched against heretics within Europe, against pagan societies in the Baltic, and against political opponents of the papacy. The language of holy war became normalized. Over time, religious justification merged with state power. Kings and rulers learned to use crusading rhetoric to legitimize expansion, taxation, and repression. In Western memory, the First Crusade retained a special status. It was remembered as heroic, miraculous, and divinely sanctioned. Later failures were treated as deviations rather than warnings. In the Islamic world, Crusades were remembered differently. They became part of a longer narrative of foreign invasion and resistance. Jerusalem's loss and recovery shaped collective identity. Historically, the Crusades were neither inevitable nor purely religious. They emerged from a specific convergence of political instability, economic change, and ideological innovation. Their legacy was not victory or defeat, but transformation. They reshaped diplomacy, warfare, trade, and religious thought across continents. By the time the medieval world gave way to early modern states, crusading had lost its original meaning, but its echoes would endure far longer than its armies. Long after the Crusades ended as military enterprises, they continued to live on as stories. These stories were not neutral recollections of the past. They were shaped, edited, and simplified to serve the needs of later generations. In medieval Europe, chronicles emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and divine favor. Defeats were explained as moral failure, not strategic error. Violence against civilians was either justified or ignored. The Crusades were framed as a righteous struggle rather than a complex historical phenomenon. Over time, this selective memory hardened into myth. The First Crusade became the model of ideal Christian unity, even though it had been chaotic, brutal, and deeply divided. Later Crusades were measured against this imagined standard and found wanting. In the Islamic world, memory followed a different trajectory. Early Muslim chroniclers treated the Crusaders as one of many invading forces. Only later did the Crusades become a central symbol of external aggression. Jerusalem's capture and recovery acquired growing emotional and religious weight. By the modern period, these divergent memories solidified. European Romanticism transformed Crusaders into noble knights. Colonial ideologies reused crusading language to legitimize expansion. In response, anti-colonial movements drew parallels between medieval Crusades and modern intervention. What mattered was not what the Crusades had been, but what they could be made to represent. History became a reservoir of symbols rather than facts. The Crusades, stripped of context, were repeatedly repurposed to explain contemporary conflicts. This process ensured that the Crusades would never fully end. Even after their armies vanished, their narratives remained active, ready to be reactivated whenever identity, faith, or power required a usable past. In the modern era, the Crusades acquired meanings their participants could never have imagined. Industrial warfare, nationalism, and global politics reshaped how the medieval past was interpreted. During the 19th century, European powers expanded into the Middle East and North Africa. Politicians, writers, and soldiers often framed these ventures in crusading language. Military campaigns were described as civilizing missions, echoing medieval justifications. This rhetoric had consequences. In many parts of the Islamic world, European imperialism was remembered not as a new phenomenon, but as a continuation of older invasions. Medieval crusaders and modern colonizers became linked in collective memory. In the 20th and 21st centuries, references to crusades reappeared in political speeches, propaganda, and extremist ideologies. The term itself became charged, capable of provoking strong reactions even when used casually. Yet these modern invocations often ignore historical reality. Medieval crusaders were not representatives of modern states or cultures. Their motivations, assumptions, and worldviews were fundamentally different. Understanding this gap is essential. When the Crusades are treated as timeless religious conflicts, they distort both past and present. They obscure the political, economic, and contingent factors that actually shaped events. The Crusades matter today not because they define an eternal struggle, but because they demonstrate how history can be simplified, weaponized, and misunderstood. They are a warning about the power of narrative. Stripped of myth and symbolism, the Crusades were the product of a specific medieval world. They emerged from demographic growth, economic change, religious reform, and political fragmentation in both Europe and the Middle East. They were not inevitable. Without the collapse of Byzantine defenses, without papal reform movements, without Muslim political division, the First Crusade would likely never have occurred. Nor were they purely religious. Faith mattered deeply, but it interacted constantly with ambition, fear, opportunity, and survival. Crusaders sought salvation, but they also sought land, status, and security. The outcomes were equally complex. The Crusades failed militarily in the long term, but succeeded in reshaping global connections. They intensified contact between civilizations, accelerated trade, and transmitted knowledge, often unintentionally. They also normalized violence framed as sacred duty. This legacy outlived the medieval world and influenced later forms of ideological warfare. The Crusades should not be judged as a single story of heroes or villains. They were a process, unfolding over centuries, shaped by human decisions under extreme conditions. Understanding them requires rejecting simple explanations. They were neither a clash of civilizations nor a noble adventure. They were a historical moment, contingent, destructive, transformative. And their true significance lies not in what they promised, but in what they revealed about power, belief, and the uses of history itself. One of the most important lessons of the Crusades is how belief and power interacted in the medieval world. Faith did not operate in isolation. It functioned within political systems, economic pressures, and personal ambition. Crusaders genuinely believed they were acting within a sacred framework. For many, the promise of salvation was real and deeply motivating. Yet belief alone did not determine outcomes. Decisions were made by individuals, kings, popes, nobles, who weighed faith against advantage, risk, and opportunity. The same is true on the opposing side. Muslim resistance was not automatic or unified. It developed slowly, shaped by political consolidation, religious reinterpretation, and leadership. Jihad, like crusade, was not a constant force, but a response to changing conditions. Throughout the Crusades, moments of restraint and cooperation existed alongside extreme violence. Alliances crossed religious boundaries. Trade continued even during warfare. Pragmatism frequently overrode ideology. This complexity challenges simple moral narratives. The Crusades were not driven by blind fanaticism alone, nor were they purely cynical power struggles. They were the result of human choices made under intense pressure, guided by belief but constrained by reality. Understanding this interaction matters because it reveals how easily sacred language can be mobilized to justify action, and how quickly it can lose control over consequences. The Crusades demonstrate that belief amplifies power but does not replace responsibility. The decisions that shaped history were made by people, not abstractions. And those decisions had consequences that extended far beyond their original intent. The First Crusade stands apart because it succeeded where later crusades failed. This success created an illusion that similar outcomes could be reproduced through repetition. In reality, the conditions that enabled the First Crusade were unique. Muslim political fragmentation, Byzantine logistical support, and extraordinary popular enthusiasm aligned only once. Later crusades operated in a fundamentally different environment. Opponents adapted. Muslim states learned to coordinate, defend territory, and exploit crusader weaknesses. European societies, meanwhile, became more cautious. Crusading lost its novelty and its emotional intensity. Institutionalization also played a role. Once crusading became routine, it lost its transformative power. Vows became bureaucratic. Motivation shifted from belief to obligation. Distance and cost became decisive constraints. The logistical challenges of sustaining overseas warfare proved insurmountable without permanent state structures, which medieval Europe lacked. Most importantly, memory distorted expectation. Later crusaders chased a mythologized version of the First Crusade rather than its reality. They pursued symbolic objectives without the means to secure them. The failure to recognize contingency turned success into dogma. The First Crusade was not a model. It was an exception. Treating it as a rule guaranteed disappointment. History rarely repeats miracles, especially when those miracles depended on circumstances that no longer exist. Seen from a distance, the Crusades occupy a paradoxical place in history. Militarily, they failed. Politically, they destabilized regions without creating durable alternatives. Yet historically, their impact was profound. They accelerated contact between civilizations that had previously interacted only indirectly. Trade expanded, ideas moved, and knowledge circulated, often despite the intentions of those involved. They reshaped institutions. The papacy expanded its ideological reach. Military orders pioneered new forms of organization. States learned to mobilize populations using belief rather than coercion alone. They also exposed limits. The Crusades demonstrated that ideology cannot permanently substitute for structure, resources, and strategy. Faith can inspire action, but it cannot sustain systems by itself. Perhaps most importantly, the Crusades reveal how history is remembered and reused. Their legacy has been repeatedly simplified to serve modern identities and conflicts. Understanding the Crusades does not require approval or condemnation. It requires clarity. They were not timeless wars between religions. They were a medieval response to specific pressures, shaped by human decisions and constrained by circumstance. Their true value lies in what they teach about power, belief, and the dangers of mythologizing the past. The Crusades ended long ago, but the way we understand them still matters. By the early 13th century, the Crusades had drifted far from their original purpose. What began as an attempt to reclaim Jerusalem and support Byzantium ended with Christian armies sacking Constantinople, the greatest city of Eastern Christianity. This moment marks the true conclusion of the classical crusading era, not because wars stopped, but because their meaning fundamentally changed. The Crusades did not reunite Christianity. Instead, they permanently deepened the divide between East and West. After 1204, the idea of a unified Christian world was no longer realistic. Byzantium survived, but it never fully recovered. The destruction of Constantinople shattered the political, economic, and cultural balance of the Eastern Mediterranean and redirected trade, wealth, and power toward Italian maritime cities. For Western Europe, the Crusades were a costly failure in military terms, but a transformative success in historical terms. Europeans encountered a wider world and realized, often painfully, that they were not its center. Contact with Islamic civilization accelerated the transmission of knowledge, technology, and practical skills, from mathematics and engineering to navigation and administration. Europe learned not through victory, but through exposure. The Crusades also reshaped warfare and power. Standing armies, professional logistics, siege engineering, and financial systems all advanced rapidly. Military religious orders blurred the line between monk and soldier, faith and violence. At the same time, the concept of holy war expanded dangerously, becoming a tool that could be applied not only against distant enemies, but against neighbors, rivals, and political opponents. Most importantly, the Crusades left a long memory. In Europe, they became stories of sacrifice and destiny. In the Islamic world, they were remembered as invasions, early experiments in foreign domination. These memories would resurface centuries later, shaping modern identities, fears, and conflicts. The Crusades did not create the modern world, but they accelerated its arrival. They forced civilizations to confront one another, misunderstand one another, and change. And once that process began, it could not be undone.